So the best place to start for all dangerous goods regulations is at the United Nations level. And this has been in existence for many, many years. As we all know, there's a committee, it's called the Subcommittee on the Transport of Dangerous Goods. And so this is a group of regulators, industry, trade associations, packaging manufacturers, battery manufacturers. So this group meets twice a year, once in summer, once in early winter in Geneva, Switzerland. And so over the course of a 2-year period, so 4 total meetings, various stakeholders bring up proposals to change dangerous goods regulations. And so those proposals can be small, fix a typo in the HazMat table, or they can be huge, grand new proposals to regulate a whole bunch of different things, right? So it can be anywhere in between. And so over those 2 years, over the 4 meetings over the course of 2 years, ultimately we kind of go through that process to see which, if any, of the proposal papers submitted are worthy and agreed upon to be adopted into the new United Nations Dangerous Goods Regulations. So every 2 years, the UN level, we call it the Orange Book or the Model Recommendations, those are kind of the basis for all hazardous material or dangerous goods regulations. Those then filter down to the different transport modes and the different countries, right? So just using the United States as an example, because that's where we're based, and that's the agency that I used to work for, the Pipeline Hazmat Safety Administration. What they try to do on a regular basis is to harmonize with international standards. So there's a very clear cadence at the international level with the United Nations that every 2 years you're going to get an update. For the US DOT, specifically Pipeline Hazmat Safety Administration, it's not always as clean as every 2 years on the date, but it is something that's kind of that rolling process that the regulators look at what happens from the international level. And keep in mind, the U.S. absolutely participates at these United Nations forums, so they're highly aware of any new proposals and new adoptions going into the regulations. So they look at the international side and say, okay, well, these 3 proposals got adopted into the international regulations, so now we need to update our United States regulations, specifically 49 CFR, typically parts 100 through 180. So they would look at international new regulations and over the course of a year or two, try to put those new regulations into the U.S. standards. Similar concept with like the International Maritime Organization that completes or writes the IMDG code for transport of dangerous goods by ocean. Similar concept with ICAO, who handles the regulations for transport of hazmat by air. So those are long established regulatory bodies that sort of make the regulations, and you kind of see how then it flows down to different transport modes and different countries around the world. And it's intended to be a harmonized system around the world to make the transport of dangerous goods not only safe, but to make it more efficient. So if you had regulations in the United States were wildly different than how they are in Brazil, that would be clearly a barrier to flow of goods. So we try to make these things as consistent and harmonized as possible. So those have been established, like I said, for many, 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 many years. Then there's also times where you have new groups. I wouldn't necessarily call them regulatory bodies necessarily, but you have these initiatives that sort of branch out of either United Nations level or DOT level or ICAO level, that they task a group of stakeholders with coming up with new standards. Easy example would be the SAE G-27. So ICAO, the group that has sort of the authority to implement global dangerous goods regulations for air transport, at that time they tasked the SAE group to say, put together a committee of regulators, of air carriers, of air manufacturers, battery manufacturers, get them all together to come up with this packaging standard that will, possibly require you to use a package that contains the thermal event of whatever batteries that you're shipping. So that is a good example of an initiative, a project that the regulators tasked to form this new group. Again, the new group is not necessarily a regulatory body, but it is something that their recommendations, their standards, ultimately will go back to the regulators for their consideration and ultimately possibly implementation into the regulations. There's another good example at the United Nations level. There's an ongoing project which has, I believe, started back in 2017 to reclassify lithium cells and batteries. This is another good example of something that at the UN level, they decided more work needed to be done on this specific topic around lithium batteries. And again, put together a group of regulators, stakeholders, industry to meet on a regular basis to further this huge project that eventually in the next 2 to 6 years will likely completely change the way lithium batteries are shipped, because it's going to likely rewrite a lot of the existing regulations regarding lithium batteries and how we move them today. So we have the ongoing regulators, at the UN level, the Subcommittee on the Transport of Dangerous Goods, that's, been formed for decades. Same concept with the individual country governments, of course, but when they do these initiatives, kind of these special scope, oftentimes they form the committee. The SAE G-27 is a good example. The committee was formed back in 2016, and I think typically we meet, there's a monthly conference call every month, but then there's also usually between 2 and 3 in-person meetings that are held around the world. So they try to rotate between, US, Canada. They were just in Europe. They've gone certainly to Japan. They were just in Japan recently. I believe Australia was on the menu. So there's basically a global meeting that at least twice, if not 3 times a year, the stakeholders can all get together in a room to advance the standard. Once the standard is finalized, once it's approved in its final form by the committee, that standard would be published by SAE and ultimately would go up to the regulators for their consideration as to whether it should be adopted into any sort of regulation. At that time, once the standard is formally and finally approved by the SAE committee, typically the committees would then dissolve after finishing their work.